Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
I didn't say a word. Not when Nathan leaned back in his chair with that same cocky grin he's been practicing since prom night. Not when he tapped the rim of his wine glass like some self-anointed after-dinner speaker and casually tossed out, "It's cute you still try that little app thing," as if it were the punchline to a joke everyone at the table had already heard and politely laughed at years ago. I just passed the mashed potatoes, nodded like I hadn't heard him, and kept my eyes fixed on the chipped edge of Grandma's porcelain turkey platter, the one she pulls out once a year like a relic from a more civil time, when we were all still pretending to like each other. That moment, frozen, quiet, almost forgettable, was the calm before a storm. None of them saw coming, the part in the story where the audience leans in because they feel something shift but can't quite name it yet. The funny thing about family dinners is how they always manage to resurface every insecurity you thought you'd already buried, like overcooked stuffing reheated for the 5th year in a row. I hadn't been looking forward to the gathering. I rarely did. It was always the same: white wine that tastes like regret, polite questions with loaded meanings, and an unspoken competition to see who could deliver the most passive-aggressive compliment before dessert. Nathan always won, and somehow I always let him. It wasn't that I lacked ambition or drive or even results. It's just that in our family, Nathan had monopolized the role of the successful one so early on that everyone else learned to orbit around him like satellites too small to matter on their own. He was the scholarship kid, the first to land a job with a 6-figure salary, the one who brought home glossy business cards with embossed logos and talked about quarterly targets and scaling solutions like he was narrating a TED Talk nobody asked for. I, on the other hand, was the creative one, which was code for unemployed until proven otherwise. When I'd first started building my app 3 years ago, long before it had a name, a prototype, or any reason to exist beyond spite, I made the mistake of mentioning it during one of these dinners. Nathan laughed. My Aunt Diane smiled like I'd said I was auditioning for American Idol. My dad asked how long I was planning to keep trying before finding something stable. And my grandmother, the only one who didn't chime in with unsolicited advice, just passed the peas and looked away. That was the last time I volunteered anything. Since then, I'd learned to do what quiet people do best: work in silence and take notes on everyone who thinks you've already lost. Tonight was no different, at least not yet. The table was the same sprawling wooden monster it had always been, inherited from some great-grandparent whose name no one remembered, but whose furniture had survived every divorce and relocation in the family, like a cursed heirloom. The centerpiece was a too-large pumpkin surrounded by those fake plastic leaves that crunch like guilt under your fingers. Grandma had done her best, as always, to make the meal feel festive, though the air in the room was anything but. Nathan had arrived late, like he always did, claiming traffic and client calls as his excuse, and everyone welcomed him with a warmth they didn't offer anyone else. He made the rounds, kissing cheeks, pouring himself a generous glass of red, making jokes about crypto and remote workers. And when he finally sat down across from me, he greeted me not with "hi" or "how are you," but with that single, casually cruel remark: "Still trying that app thing, huh?" I could have said something. I could have reminded him that the world has changed, that building something from nothing takes more guts than recycling the same pitch deck to a room full of middle managers. I could have told him about the all-nighters, the investor meetings, the near-death months where I wasn't sure if rent or groceries would win. But I didn't. I just smiled and nodded and let him keep talking because I knew something he didn't. While he talked about golf retreats and IPOs he wasn't actually a part of, my phone buzzed softly in my pocket. Once, then twice. I didn't need to check it. I already knew what it said. The final signatures had gone through. The deal was closed. My app, the one he thought was a joke, had just acquired a majority stake in the company that employed him. The irony tasted better than the turkey, but that moment, the actual reveal, wasn't mine to deliver. That would come later. For now, I just let the room hum with its usual mix of tension and cranberry sauce. Nathan kept performing for the family, talking about market projections he didn't understand, bragging about bonuses he hadn't earned. And I just kept chewing, kept quiet, kept watching the little cracks form in his confidence. Grandma hadn't said much all night. She rarely did when Nathan was holding court. But I noticed her eyes were on me more than usual. Not in a worried way, but in that faintly amused, vaguely calculating way she sometimes looked at slot machines in Atlantic City. Like she could tell when something was about to pay off. She didn't ask me anything about work. She didn't need to. She just gave me a look that said, "Hold." And I did. Because dessert hadn't hit the table yet. And neither had the truth. Growing up in a family where success was measured not in happiness or fulfillment or even stability, but in titles, salaries, and the number of people who clapped when you walked into a room, meant that my story was always going to be told in terms of contrast. Nathan was the sun everyone gathered around, and I was the flickering light bulb in the hallway nobody bothered to replace. For as long as I could remember, failure had followed me like a rumor whispered too many times to be denied. Not because I failed more than others, but because when I did, it was public, messy, and always retold by someone who wasn't even there. My family didn't mean to weaponize my disappointments, but over time, the laughter at my expense became a tradition. One of those little things like green bean casserole or cranberry sauce from a can that showed up at every gathering, whether anyone actually liked it or not. There was the bakery idea when I was 24, the one I tried to get off the ground with a college friend who bailed the second rent was due. Then the dog walking startup that crashed and burned when I realized I was allergic to most breeds. And later, the freelance marketing hustle that mostly involved designing logos for people who paid in compliments and exposure. I tried. God, I tried so hard. But no one ever remembered the effort. Only the punchlines. How's the muffin empire coming along? Or still allergic to income? Or Nathan's personal favorite. At least she keeps things interesting. What they never saw, because I never let them, was how each failure chipped away at my confidence like water carving stone, slow, steady, and devastatingly effective. The night before that dinner, I lay awake in my apartment staring at the cracked ceiling, thinking about not going, not because I was scared of the comments or the snide remarks, but because I was afraid of how much I'd let them shrink me over the years. I had done what they said, kept my head down, got realistic, stayed humble, and somehow still ended up the cautionary tale they used to make their own choices feel smarter. But somewhere between my last breakdown and the day Sarah walked into that grimy coffee shop with her oversized headphones and wild hair full of ideas and chaos, something in me shifted. Sarah wasn't like anyone I had ever worked with. She didn't care about optics or LinkedIn bios or what our parents thought about burn rates. She had this way of talking about tech that felt less like strategy and more like rebellion, like the goal wasn't just to build something that worked, but something that could not be ignored. We met through a mutual acquaintance, both burned out, both tired of talking to people who didn't listen, and over bitter coffee and shared frustration, we started sketching an idea on a napkin. That napkin became a whiteboard, which became a wireframe, which became a beta. We didn't even name it until we had working code. The app itself wasn't revolutionary, not in the traditional headline-grabbing sense, but it solved a quiet, persistent problem that no one else seemed to care about: how to give small, local creators access to enterprise-grade analytics without selling their souls to big platforms. It was boring to explain, impossible to pitch in a single sentence, and utterly unsexy to anyone who hadn't spent time clawing for relevance in an algorithm-ruled world. But it worked. And more importantly, it grew, not in viral bursts, but in steady, compounding ripples. We didn't seek venture capital right away. Sarah had seen too many friends lose control of their vision to money men who promised acceleration and delivered chaos. Instead, we bootstrapped. Late nights, ramen dinners, running code on outdated laptops that froze every time we hit compile. I took contract gigs on the side. She did consulting work that made her cry into her keyboard at least once a week. But we believed in the thing we were building, and more importantly, we believed in each other. And it paid off. Not all at once, not with fireworks or headlines, but in the slow, quiet way that success sometimes sneaks up on you when you're too busy surviving to notice you're winning. We landed a big client, then another, word spread. Reviews poured in, our servers started crashing from real traffic instead of bugs. And still, I said nothing to my family. Not because I wanted to surprise them, but because I didn't want to give them another thing to diminish. I wasn't going to let Nathan call it adorable or ask if it was just a side hustle until it wasn't. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, we were already deep in acquisition talks. The irony, of course, was that the company we were in discussions with was floundering, desperate for a product like ours to plug a gaping hole in their user retention funnel. And wouldn't you know, it was the same company Nathan had been boasting about for years, the one he claimed would take him straight to the VP level by next summer. Sarah and I had kept things quiet, careful, clinical, no personal vendettas, just business. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little thrill when I saw the name of Nathan's employer in the due diligence packet. At the dinner table, while Nathan yammered on about how the future of tech was consolidation and how his team was crushing Q4, my phone buzzed with the subject line, "Acquisition finalized. Welcome to the team." I glanced at it, smiled to myself, and then tucked it away. He was talking about a company that no longer belonged to the people who hired him. He was praising leadership that would soon report to mine. And still, I said nothing, because sometimes silence is the loudest statement you can make. And sometimes the best revenge is letting the truth speak for itself, at just the right moment. That moment wasn't far off, and it wasn't going to come from me, because someone else at the table, someone who had been watching and listening far more than anyone realized, was about to break the silence in a way that even I couldn't have planned. But not yet. First came the sweet potatoes, then the wine, and finally, the fire. There's something almost comical about watching someone build a house of cards with so much self-assurance that they don't even notice when the table starts to shake beneath them. And that night, as Nathan went on about his performance bonus and the restructuring plan that was supposedly going to streamline operations, I found myself wondering just how many people had smiled at him the way I was smiling now, quietly, knowingly, and with the kind of patience you only develop when you've learned that sometimes the sweetest moments in life come not with applause, but with restraint. He had no idea, of course, that while he was gesturing with his wine glass and talking about corporate synergy like it was a religion, the structure he'd been climbing for the past 5 years had already shifted, bent, and snapped beneath him. That the company he bragged about as if it were his personal creation had, as of 3 hours ago, become a wholly owned subsidiary of the startup he once called a glorified spreadsheet. But to understand the full weight of that moment, you'd have to understand everything that led up to it. The mess, the exhaustion, the near misses, the fights over whether to pivot or push through. The days Sarah and I nearly walked away from it all because it felt like screaming into a void that never echoed back. Building a company from the ground up when no one believes in you isn't some underdog fairy tale. It's a marathon in the dark, barefoot, uphill, with people you love sometimes turning into people you outgrow. And still, we built it. Every damn line of code, every late-night customer support reply, every investor who told us, maybe later, every spreadsheet filled with projections we barely believed ourselves. We built it with blood and coffee and arguments and apologies. I remember the first time we got a real user testimonial from someone who said the platform helped them finally understand where their income was coming from and why. She was a single mom in Ohio, juggling 2 Etsy stores and a Patreon, and she said it changed how she planned her week. That one email hit me harder than any investor meeting ever did, because for the first time, it felt like we weren't just surviving, we were actually useful. Meanwhile, Nathan was moving laterally through the corporate world, collecting job titles like merit badges, always finding ways to position himself next to success and make it look like he'd built the rocket, even though he'd never once touched the launch pad. I watched him from a distance, not out of jealousy. I'd long stopped wanting what he had, but out of curiosity because I needed to understand how someone could move through the world so loudly and still say nothing of substance. His company had good branding, a slick website, and enough jargon to choke a room full of consultants. But underneath it all, they were drowning, hemorrhaging users, unable to modernize, desperate for a fix that wouldn't require admitting failure. And that's where we came in. Our product didn't just plug their leaks, it rerouted their entire pipeline. We offered clarity in a market drowning in complexity, and when we finally agreed to the acquisition after months of negotiation and scrutiny, we did so not as desperate founders looking for a payday, but as architects of a new structure, one where we retained control and dictated terms. I knew Nathan wouldn't understand that. He lived in a world where titles mattered more than ownership, where proximity to power was mistaken for having it. At the dinner table, my phone buzzed again, this time with a Slack notification from Sarah. "We're live. PR team is on it." That meant the press release had hit the wire. That meant anyone with Google and a passing interest in corporate news would now know that our company, our little app thing, had just swallowed his employer whole. I didn't check it. I didn't have to. I just took another sip of water, nodded politely at whatever story Uncle Rob was telling about tax deductions, and glanced across the table at Nathan, who was reaching for his phone with the kind of smug casualness that always made my jaw tighten. It took less than 5 seconds for his expression to shift, and I watched it closely, noting how his brow furrowed first, then his jaw clenched, then his fingers gripped the edge of the phone like it might say something different if he just held it tighter. He didn't say anything, not right away. He just stared at the screen, blinking hard, then looked up at me, confused, like he'd just walked into a room he thought he owned and found someone else sitting in the chair with his name on it. I held his gaze for just a moment, long enough for him to wonder if I knew, but not long enough to give him the certainty. Then I looked away and asked Grandma to pass the rolls. I could see the gears turning in his head, the way he tried to recalibrate his mental model of the universe to make room for a version where I wasn't a punchline, but a problem, an anomaly, an outlier, a variable he'd never accounted for. His world was built on assumptions. That people stay in the boxes you put them in, that sisters don't outshine brothers. That tech is for guys in hoodies or suits, but never for women who learn to code after 10 at night because they were working double shifts during the day. He didn't ask me anything, not then. I think part of him hoped it wasn't true, or maybe he was trying to figure out if it was some kind of mistake. A different company with the same name, a misprint. But there it was in black and white, our logo next to his, the headline announcing a strategic acquisition and naming me as the incoming CTO of the merged entity. Sarah had insisted we include that title. It meant nothing to me, but everything to the people like Nathan, who needed labels to understand worth. I didn't need to say anything, not yet. I had waited 3 years for this moment, and I could wait a few minutes longer. Besides, dessert hadn't hit the table, and Grandma hadn't spoken. And when she did, it would be the kind of sentence that lives forever in family lore, the kind you retell. Not because it's kind, but because it's true, and because you need to remind yourself that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe gives quiet people the loudest lines. There's a certain energy that fills a room right before something shifts irrevocably, a kind of silent static that hums between bodies and settles like a charge in the space behind your eyes. And as I sat there in that warm, dimly lit dining room beneath the heavy clink of cutlery and the fake cheer of family stories that had been told too many times, I felt that electricity begin to spark in the air like a storm was coming. Only no one but me seemed to notice the clouds. Nathan had barely touched his plate since reading the headline on his phone, and though he tried to keep his features arranged in the familiar architecture of smug detachment, I could see the cracks forming around his mouth, the slight twitch of his jaw as he pressed his lips together too tightly, the way he kept glancing sideways at me like I might suddenly stand up and declare what he feared but couldn't yet accept, that the company he had built his entire professional identity around had just been rerouted, restructured, and redefined by someone he had never bothered to take seriously. He wasn't speaking anymore, which in itself was a kind of miracle. Because Nathan never let silence hang in the air without trying to fill it with his voice, his opinions, his knowledge, real or fabricated, his endless arsenal of anecdotes that always positioned him as the savior of some pitch meeting or the cleverest man at the networking event. But now his silence was loud, heavy even, like a held breath that threatened to collapse in on itself. And I could tell that every second that ticked by without clarity was becoming more unbearable for him than anything I could have said aloud. I wasn't being petty. I wasn't being coy. I was simply doing what I had always done when cornered by assumptions. I waited, knowing that the truth, when timed right, could land harder than any argument, sharper than any insult, and far more elegantly than the clumsy weapons of defensiveness or pride. And the truth was this. 6 months earlier, Sarah and I had been invited into a closed-door strategy meeting with a group of executives who were trying and failing to salvage what had once been a promising software firm, now bleeding users, burning cash, and losing ground to more agile competitors. They were looking for a lifeline, something innovative enough to make their investors believe in resurrection, something simple enough to deploy without blowing up what little infrastructure still worked, and something cheap enough to acquire without triggering a shareholder revolt. Our platform, lean and modular and battle-tested by chaos, was the perfect fit. We didn't pitch to them, they found us. They came to us after a report mentioned our model as the quiet threat no one was watching, and when they realized we could do in 3 weeks what their internal teams hadn't done in 18 months, the conversation changed from partnership to acquisition. But Sarah and I weren't interested in being folded into a dysfunctional empire just to be ignored, overruled, or diluted. We weren't selling out, we were leveling up, and we had conditions. We wanted control over product direction, autonomy over our team, and a clear path to leadership within the new structure. They balked at first, they stalled, they bluffed, but in the end, they signed because they had no choice. Because desperation is the greatest motivator, and because when they looked at our numbers and projections and user growth, they saw not 2 women with a scrappy app, but a salvation disguised in subtlety. The deal was quiet, strategic, and deliberate. And it put me, officially and contractually, in a position that now made Nathan's role not irrelevant, but certainly subordinate. He didn't know yet what it would mean for him, not exactly. He didn't know that his regional sales director would now be reporting to someone who would be reporting to me. He didn't know that the new onboarding packet, set to go out the following Monday, included a message from the leadership team that featured my name in bold under the heading, Vision for the Future. And he certainly didn't know that his next scheduled internal meeting, which he'd been preparing for, with what I could only imagine was his usual blend of bluster and recycled PowerPoint slides, had been quietly reassigned to a department that was being absorbed by ours. He was standing at the edge of a professional cliff, and I had quietly moved the guardrail while he wasn't looking. I didn't say any of this, of course. I just buttered a roll and watched him wrestle with whatever version of reality he was trying to preserve inside his head. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about balance. About finally feeling the scales shift in a direction that made sense, that acknowledged not just my effort, but the years of erasure, the endless moments where I'd swallowed my pride so someone else could feel taller. And that's when Grandma leaned forward, setting down her fork with the kind of grace that only women in their 80s can muster when they're about to say something that will land like thunder. She looked straight at Nathan, not with judgment, not even with smugness, but with that quiet curiosity she always reserved for when something didn't add up, and said, "So why did the news say she's your new boss?" The room froze. It was the kind of silence that isn't really silent, because underneath it, you can hear the rushing of blood in your ears, the tightening of throats, the metallic click of reality locking into place. My uncle stopped mid-chew. My aunt blinked like she'd misheard. My mother stiffened beside the wine bottle, and my father leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in disbelief. Only Sarah, thousands of miles away, would have known what that sentence meant to me. It was everything I hadn't said. everything I'd chosen to withhold. And now it was out there, simple, clean, and irreversible. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, his voice catching somewhere between indignation and confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but the question wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was a plea hurled into a space that no longer answered to him. Grandma didn't blink. She didn't smile. She simply said, "It was on the 6 o'clock news. Channel 5. Big merger. Your name came up, so did hers." I looked at him then fully, without disguise, and this time I didn't look away. He didn't ask for confirmation. He didn't need to, and I didn't offer it, because there was nothing left to prove. The table had turned, the power had shifted, and the next course was being served. Whether or not he had the stomach for it was no longer my concern. For a brief and almost disorienting moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The room, the people, even the clinking of forks, and the lazy rotation of the ceiling fan. As if the universe itself had paused to listen, to lean in closer, to bear witness to a revelation it had been waiting far too long to deliver. I sat there in the stillness, surrounded by dishes scraped clean and wine glasses nearly empty, and I watched the ripples of Grandma's question move across the table like the tremor that comes before an earthquake. Slow at first, then picking up momentum as each family member processed what they'd just heard, struggling to reconcile the Rachel they thought they knew, the dreamer, the dabbler, the sweet but directionless younger sister, with the Rachel who, according to the evening news, now held a position of authority so contradictory to their narrative that it might as well have been fiction. Nathan, to his credit, didn't lash out, didn't raise his voice, didn't immediately launch into one of his usual dismissive monologues designed to regain control of the room by sheer force of volume or charisma. Instead, he sat very still, shoulders tensed, face drawn in that very specific way people's faces draw when they've just realized they've underestimated someone not once or twice, but over and over again, until their version of that person has become so outdated that they don't even know where to begin rebuilding it. I watched him from across the table, not out of cruelty or smugness, but out of a quiet kind of curiosity, the same way you might watch a glacier crack, slow, deliberate, inevitable, and I wondered if he'd finally understand what it felt like to be seen, not for who you were a decade ago, but for what you'd managed to become while no one was looking. I didn't say anything. I hadn't said anything all night, and I wasn't about to start now. There's a unique kind of power in restraint, in refusing to perform your success just because someone finally noticed it. And though every part of me, every version of me that had once cried in parking lots, after failed meetings or bit my tongue while being laughed at in kitchens just like this one, wanted to shout, to gloat, to explain how long and hard the road had been, how many sacrifices, how many nights spent coding with numb fingers and blurry eyes, I held back, not out of fear, but out of resolve. Because this moment wasn't about making them understand. It was about finally being free from needing them to. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind that comes when people are full and content and lost in thought. It was thick, loaded, and uneven, like a room that had just lost its center of gravity. Aunt Diane glanced at me, then at Nathan, her expression flickering between surprise and something like suspicion, as though she were recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the family hierarchy. Uncle Rob coughed into his napkin, perhaps to cut the tension, or perhaps because he genuinely didn't know what else to do with his mouth. My mother shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, and my father stared at his empty plate as if hoping it might offer answers he couldn't find in his daughter's eyes. And then, because someone had to break the silence and because people like Nathan can never leave well enough alone, he leaned back slightly, forced a chuckle, and said, "Well, I guess I'll be seeing you in meetings then, huh?" It was meant to sound light, teasing, almost amused, but the crack in his voice gave him away, and for the first time in years, I saw something raw in his face. Not anger, not arrogance, but doubt. He was trying to wrap this new reality in humor, trying to tame it with charm, because he didn't know how to face it head on without unraveling something fundamental about how he saw himself. I offered him a smile, small and unreadable, and replied, "Only if you're still on the calendar by Monday." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a jab. It was a fact. Because I wasn't the same woman he'd spent a decade patronizing at family gatherings, and the world he thought he controlled was now, at least partially, mine to influence. And I wasn't interested in revenge, not in the dramatic Hollywood sense of the word. What I wanted, what I had earned, was space, room to breathe, to build, to lead, without constantly being compared to someone who had never once considered the possibility that I might catch up, let alone pass him. Dessert was never served. Whether because Grandma sensed the moment had reached its natural conclusion or because she simply preferred to let the dinner end on her terms, no one reached for the pie and no one complained. The plates remained stacked, untouched, the sweet course of the evening replaced by something far more intoxicating and far less expected: consequence. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately, pausing only to thank Grandma for the meal, which she acknowledged with a single nod and a look that said she had known, perhaps all along, that I would eventually come into my own, not with fireworks, but with quiet certainty. Outside, the air was sharp and cool, the kind of late autumn chill that bites at your fingers and reminds you you're alive. I walked to my car alone, my boots crunching against the gravel, the sky overhead smeared with stars that no one inside would take the time to notice. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message that simply read, "Internal rollout starts tomorrow, looping in Nathan's team, per your note." I stared at it for a second, then locked the screen without replying, sliding the device into my coat pocket, like it was just another object, just another tool, not the tether to the future I had spent years building from broken confidence and stubborn grit. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the traditional sense. I felt calm, settled, like a long-held breath had finally been released, and I no longer had to prove anything to anyone, not to Nathan, not to my parents, not to the relatives who had always smiled at my dreams like they were polite delusions. I had arrived, and not by their map or their metrics, but by mine. And for once, that was enough. The next morning, I woke up to headlines, to emails, to 100 unread messages, and more congratulations than I knew what to do with. But none of it felt as satisfying as that single glance across the table, that quiet acknowledgement that the story they had written for me had ended, and I had started my own. Whether Nathan ever said the words didn't matter, because the truth had already landed, and the silence that followed would echo louder than anything he could have said.